Hello and a warm welcome to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm your moderator, Peter Lavelle. Russia is in the news again, and in a big way, though not in the most positive light, to say the least. U.S. President Barack Obama has canceled his one-on-one with Russian President Vladimir Putin ahead of G20. There is the Edward Snowden affair, Syria, anti-missile defense, and of course, human rights issues. There are those who say there's a new Cold War in play. Others say, who really cares what Washington and Moscow think about each other? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest in London, Alexander Nekrassov, former advisor to the Kremlin. We have James Thackara. He's a novelist and human rights activist. Charlie Wolf. He's a U.S.-based American broadcaster and a political commentator. And joining me here in VOR's Moscow studio is Andrey Sushentsov, political analyst at Moscow State University of International Relations. And he's an expert in U.S. foreign policy. Alexander, if I can go to you first. I approximately know what your age is, so we both remember the Cold War very, very well. Are we entering a new Cold War with Russia and the United States?
No, we are not entering a Cold War simply because there are no two different ideological systems opposed to each other and basically threatening each other with nuclear weapons. So, no, you can't call this nuclear war situation, a Cold War situation. But what we can say is that it was actually President Obama who introduced this sort of Cold War talk and accused President Putin of having a Cold War mentality, basically himself promoting a stance like that, because canceling a summit with the president of another country is a very, very serious move. I think personally it was a big mistake, and I think it was sort of a revenge for the Snowden affair, and with the Americans turning tables around and saying that you should have returned Snowden to us, although he was not any longer American citizen, by the way, because his citizenship was revoked. And I think it was a sort of a revenge thing. And I don't think this is proper policy.
James, if I can go to you, I was watching President Obama on the Jay Leno show, and I found it extremely telling because he mentioned that the Russians have a Cold War mentality once in a while. And Jay Leno said, well, is it like talking to head of KGB? And Obama turned around and said, yes, Vladimir Putin was head of the KGB, but he never was head of the KGB. He was head of the FSB. My point in bringing this up is that who does have the Cold War mentality?
Cold War mentality. I mean, I'm very sorry to hear Alexander say that we have Cold War mentality. It is, in fact, Vladimir Putin who's backing Assad in the Syria situation, and we've cooperated with his point of view by not backing the opposition, and the result of that has been that we now have a Sudan-Iran weapons supply going through Turkey, quite dangerous. I don't see any reason why the Russians should be supporting Assad. Assad can take care of himself. This almost has a Sudetenland look to it. There's a huge Russian influence in Syria, and I think the Russians have no business there. So this has been the bone of contention.
Does the United States have business in Syria?
The United States isn't doing any business in Syria.
It's supplying weapons to the rebels already, and the covert operations were sanctioned by Obama 2 years ago in Syria.
Well, I think we're actually staying out of there, and we've been accused of getting in, but I don't think America's particularly involved there. The Sudanese and the Iranians are there. That's something the Russians do not want, and that's because we're not heavily arming them, actually.
Charlie Wolf.
Yes, no, I don't think there's a new Cold War, but there is a lot of fecklessness, unfortunately, on the part of Mr. Obama, who's not handled this well, who's handled it with weakness and appeasement. And unfortunately, Mr. Putin is taking advantage of it, and in a sense, who can blame him? Now, as far as the Snowden affair is concerned, yes, it's a big deal. What Snowden has done is very wrong, and he needs to come back and face justice. Just a small point, his citizenship wasn't taken away, just his passport. He's still a U.S. citizen. But the way Mr. Obama has handled this is a way that he would have ironically accused Mr. Bush of handling this. He's allowed Snowden to become a big deal. He's allowed Mr. Putin to poke Mr. Obama in the eye, and then reacted in a way that I think was wrong. I think that if you're going to do something major, then do something major, or do nothing at all. But don't do a half-hearted effort. I would have canceled the whole G20 summit. I wouldn't have shown up at all. But if you're going to go, then sit down with Mr. Putin.
Don't you think that really is an exaggeration?
I'm saying
two countries have relations. Yeah. Even the secretaries of defense and state,
I agree.
met right at the same time.
What I'm saying is, in other words, if it's that important to Mr. Obama to do something, then go whole hog. Or if not, I would have rather seen him show up and sit down with Putin like a man, and then at the press conference call him out on human rights abuses or on Snowden or whatever, and make the case.
But But will he apologize for spying, for example, on the Russian president? Will he apologize
I don't
for
think
that?
the Russian president minds.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Every nation spies on every other nation. So I mean that's
No,
a bit
you
of
were
a,
caught
that's-
red-handed,
that's-
unfortunately.
well,
There's nothing you can
that's a
say
bit
for
of-
that.
that's a bit of a red herring
I totally
that-
disagree with Charlie over this.
Okay,
I
gentlemen, I'm gonna go here.
actually going to visit Julian Assange, and I've been deeply involved in WikiLeaks, and I think Putin defending Snowden is a valiant thing to do. I would think that perhaps in this question of human rights, they ought to ask themselves the question in Russia whether allowing Snowden to stay doesn't mean that they're saying okay to own NGOs, because WikiLeaks is a much more dangerous NGO than Memorial or Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, who have been slightly harassed in the situation. I mean, I don't think the Russians need to do that, and I think they've taken the right move by supporting Snowden, and I would argue this forever, Charlie. I mean, your comments about Obama, absurd. Obama invaded two countries and killed 1 million people, and you say that not getting involved in Syria is somehow some kind of Cold War act? I mean, that's insane.
I didn't say it was a Cold War act.
Gentlemen, let me jump in here. We have one more guest on the program that hasn't spoken. Andrey, give me more of a Russia-centric perspective here.
Well, actually, here in Russia, we don't see this as a new Cold War or anything like this. Actually, this catchword appears, every month or something when something bad happens in the Russian-American relations. The thing is that I think our relations in this situation are quite situational for quite a long period of time. Probably even the reset was quite a situational thing, because Dmitry Medvedev was eager first to, just flip the page, which has been there from Bush Jr. And any president, Medvedev, Putin, or any American president, I think there will be a slightly or completely different note in Russian-American relations. For now,
can I pick up on that point that Andrei just made? The world is in a catastrophic situation right now, and the governments of the world are all having a hard time dealing with it, and serious people fly under the radar. There are serious people in Russia, America, China, everywhere who are dealing with the serious problems in the world, and we have a government problem. We have a kind of vaudeville going on in American democracy and Russia, China, everywhere. The governments are not dealing with these situations. What's actually happening in the world is happening on a sub-governmental level. So I think there's no talk of still Cold War. I mean, people may brandish noises at each other and complain about each other's behavior and disagree on policy, but these are just healthy policy disagreements. This is not a Cold War.
Well, but some of it, and again, I agree with you, it's not a Cold War. I don't think it's anything approaching a Cold War. But we're in a position right now where America appears to be weak, where it appears Mr. Putin doesn't give a fig as to what Mr. Obama does. If he wants to pull out of the Olympics, it doesn't bother Mr. Putin, and I'm not suggesting we should.
That brings up a very good point, because what is Mr. Obama's policy? Look at Syria. It's almost schizophrenic. And then you look at the American political establishment, and it gets even worse. From a Russian perspective, looking outside, what do these Americans want? And then you look at the Sochi Games, and then you look at an amendment to a law in Russia, where a lot of people here disagree with, and there are protests. But it seems like so many things are being mixed together. It doesn't seem a very mature political dialogue, and I think this is what's derailing a lot of things. What do you think about that, Alexander?
Well, I think that Obama's foreign policy generally is confused and disoriented. I think he has a very weak team. He always had a very weak team. He is a novice in foreign affairs completely. And I think that before it was Hillary Clinton, now we have John Kerry. They're not really the greatest of spokesmen. They're not really the peacemakers that they claim to be. And we can see it in the Middle East. I've spoken to a former American ambassador to one of the countries. He said it's a mess. The Americans have created a mess in the Middle East. It will take decades now to try to sort it out. And this pathetic attempt to launch a new peace process between Israel and Palestinians, it looks helpless. It looks absolutely pathetic. It's a PR stunt because they need to sort out so many other countries.
I was just going to say, to agree with you, in the American...
Egypt is having a civil war there, and Americans carry a lot of blame for that. And yet they're trying sort of a stunt, a gimmick, that they're trying to sort out the process without giving it any thought at all.
You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. Charlie, it looks like you were trying to chime in.
Oh, yeah, I was just to agree to a large extent, and James, I'm sure, will disagree, understandably, but in the American, at least conservative press, they're saying this has been some of the worst foreign policy fecklessness that we've seen, probably outdoing the Carter administration. And you're right, the messages are confused. We're either leading from behind or leading up from, we don't seem to know where we're leading from. And in actual fact, I think a better course, though he was excoriated for it, was at least someone like a Mr. Romney during the campaign, was at least honest in saying Russia is our biggest geopolitical foe. It didn't say it was an enemy, but said it was a foe. And at least there's
okay,
but wait a minute, let me finish.
I mean,
at least there's an honesty. There was an honesty there.
The United States. Can you give me in one category?
Actually, that's a problem. I don't see any aspect in which Russia is a threat to the United States.
I didn't say threat. I didn't say threat.
The situation is right now, I hope.
Well, foe is a hostile word anyway.
There is a lot of unilateral
attitudes
towards each other, I think. Both Russia and the United States like to do things unilaterally, and that is the problem in bilateral relations. The thing is that we have disagreements on Syria, for example. It does in most cases with the lack of experience on the side of the United States in dealing with the collided security structures, like in Iraq or in Libya. Russia, in its own experience, knows what it means when the security structure collapses. And thus, Russia does not support Bashar al-Assad. It
supports the sovereignty of the Syrian state.
Even if we will speak in terms that will be, pragmatic and specific and concrete, it searches for a situation where less people will die. And the only possible solution for this is to strengthen or fix the situation which exists now. No experience in the recent 20 years have shown that after changing anything externally, peace governs for a period of time where this happened. And thus, Russia is quite cautious on all of these situations like in Libya
maybe
and
putting
Syria.
it in a nutshell, I mean, Russia is very cautious because you never know what the consequences of every action is going to be. This is the lesson of the last 20 years. Alexandra, what do you think about that? Because, Russia has a very tepid attitude towards the Arab Spring, if it's called that anymore. There's the laws of unintended consequences are out there. We see it all across the board. We see Iraq going into chaos again as well.
Well, I think that Russia demonstrated goodwill with Libya because the West was saying that we're going to go in, we're going to change the regime, but it will be better. Now we know it is not better. It's much worse now. And that's why I think Libya, is the main reason why not just Russia. By the way, we're always forgetting about China. Have you noticed that when we talk to Americans or Western experts, they never mention China, who is, by the way, a member of this permanent member of Security Council who supports Russia on Syria. Now, we must remember this. These are two big nations who understand and probably have a history that tells them that you don't change things at once, that you don't go in heavy-handedly without even knowing who one of the sides is. Like in Syria, Americans accept that they don't know who are these rebels.
This is just rubbish you're talking, Alexander.
No, let me finish first. And to say that Americans are not involved in Syria is rubbish because they have been doing covert operations there and Obama signed the order. They have been supplying or allowing to supply weapons to Syrian rebels because the Syrian army is one of the best in the Middle East. Now, how can anyone explain to me that the rebels are still there? So they're getting arms, they're getting a lot of things.
Chinese weapons.
It doesn't matter.
They
are supplied by different countries and so on. Turkey has been quietly looking the other way when the arms were going to the rebels. So Americans are involved. Britain is involved. France is involved. Saudi Arabians are involved. I sometimes get the feeling that the Saudi Arabians have subcontracted America, Britain, and France. Showing them that 40 billion. Well, they're offering them 40 billion.
Something that Andrey said earlier is that we look at the major powers, but actually it's a lot of the smaller powers aligned with the major powers, that the major powers don't have a whole lot of, for lack of a better word, control over. Saudi Arabia is a very good example here. Turkey is another example here, where they're not aligned with the mindset in Washington because everyone has different agendas here, different geopolitical interests.
Am I allowed to speak a little bit in answering thousands of points that were made here? Obama is not muddled. Obama is defending the Cairo speech. We got involved with two wars because Israel is in an extremely difficult position and has been since the formation of the Jewish state, and their security position has become our security position. And the result is we invaded two countries, and at the time Obama was elected, I would have thought as an American and as a patriot that we would never, ever extricate ourselves from the situation that Bush had gotten us into, including the surveillance operation that they've been building up since the War Powers Act of 1941. Obama's very carefully trying to stay out of there, and actually for Israel's benefit, because the Arab world has to solve its non-democratic problems itself. And that's what I think is very awkward for Russia to be so publicly supporting Assad, because in fact the Syrians are going to have to sort out their situation, as are the Egyptians, and I hope the Israeli army doesn't get involved.
Maybe with Russia's involvement, we'll still have a Syrian state that can resolve its own issues at home, okay? Because this is really what's at stake, is avoiding a catastrophic collapse of the Syrian state.
So I don't think we're opposing the Russians in this situation. I think we'd like them to be out of there, and we'd like to be out of there, to tell you the truth.
I don't think Russia is really in as much as everyone tends to think. That's kind of the Western media spiel these days. Andrey here with me. I mean, take a look at the issues that have been brought up recently, the human rights issues. Again, and I'm speaking to many Russians here, what right does the United States have to speak about human rights when it really violates so many of the rights of American people, when we look at the NSA scandal and whatnot?
Actually, this human rights topic was, during all of this decades, the topic which the United States elaborated upon quite efficiently. And I think that it is quite an uncomfortable topic for Russia, at least it was. But currently, I think that Russian government acts in a consensus with Russian society. A lot of noise in Western media on these anti-gay laws. And if you would read this law, you would see that only the propaganda things are prohibited. The law is not that strict as it is depicted, actually. Russia is very known for its traditional way of thinking. It doesn't deal only...
Conservative.
Well, yes. It doesn't deal only with the Russian Orthodoxy, but also we have a lot of Muslim population. Some people say that up to 10 to 15%. And these people also does not support this kind of behavior. So generally, I don't see this quite an internal Russian thing. I don't see anything international in this. And no direct connection even with Sochi. We had a remark on that this law would not be applied that strictly during the Sochi Olympics. But generally, I think that this is not a campaign, but an episode in bilateral relations. And I don't see how this issue could stand as a bilateral. Actually, Russia doesn't want to press even the United States on the human rights issues. But I think Russian foreign ministry reciprocally started to publish a report on the state of the human rights in the United States.
Guantanamo Bay is a good example of human rights violations.
But I don't see that Russia uses this theme against the United States as it could have.
Okay,
used.
well, James, can you speak to that? Because that's one of the things that Washington loves to do. When the Russians don't do what they're supposed to do, quote unquote, they pull out human rights issues and start battering away.
Well, one of the universalist under-the-radar elements in the world right now, which I think we depend on enormously, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And even though it was partly an American invention, I think everybody should be talking about it. I think it's become, having been involved with human rights since the early 70s, during the Soviet period, I think it's rather tiresome to hear people talking about human rights all the time. But there are human rights issues throughout all this. And I would agree with any Russian right now who would say that America is in a very hypocritical position to talk about nuclear, to talk about nuclear weapons, to talk about human rights. However, you have to remember that we have a very pluralistic society, and our human rights groups very often are quite opposed to our government. And we wage, some of the human rights groups I know wage war on our prison system and a lot of our behavior. And many of our NGOs are opposing Guantanamo Bay, which, by the way, Obama said he was going to shut it down, and he's moved two people to Algeria. Again, yes. But he's opposed with 1.4 million high-security cleared NSA Homeland Security people who were built up in the aftermath of 2001. And this has gotten larger and larger. We're in 120 countries. There are 800 companies in America involved, 17,000 sites around the country. This is an apparatus that everybody in the world should tremble at, and a great deal of our ACLU...
It's good business. It's good business, though. I feel sorry for the American taxpayer, though.
Wait a minute. For all its wrongs, you cannot compare the human rights record of the United States, that at least has a constitution and has a free and open society, with, for instance, Russia, where journalists are disappearing. Now, I think that, unfortunately, Mr. Obama...
That's assuming the government is behind it. And, when people make and I'm not saying you're making this accusation, but when people do make this innuendo, I never see evidence to support it. It's just assumed somehow. I was on vacation last week, and I was in the beautiful city of Venice, and I was watching France 24, and they had a short report about weather in Russia. And at the end of the report, it blamed Putin for the weather. I was astounded.
Well, I don't think anybody at this table is blaming Putin for the weather.
What I'm saying is that, Russia is not a monolithic place. As a matter of fact, after living here for 15 years, it's always borderline chaos, the way I look at it.
Unfortunately,
Charlie, you want to jump in?
I was going to say, one of the problems with Mr. Obama is that he's taken this sort of attitude, starting with the reset button, starting with well, Hillary Clinton was unfortunately a hard worker, a lot of air miles, but essentially a feckless Secretary of State, and John Kerry is not going to be much better. Did not stand up where it was needed to Mr. Putin and the Russians on issues of human rights. And we've gotten to this sort of malaise. We started with the reset button. We started with, I can call it an appeasement of taking away the missile defense from Eastern Europe, with nothing in return. And Mr. Putin is, I'll take my hat off to Mr. Putin. He's been around. He knows the score. And he looks at Mr. Obama and he says, this guy's not a leader. He's not all that serious. I'm not scared of him. Why should I be? So, one of the reasons why he snubbed Obama on Putin, on Snowden, was because he could.
Charlie, in Russia, maybe it cuts a lot of water to take off your shirt and show what a man you are, but I don't think Obama's the kind of person who takes off his shirt to show what a man he is.
No, I'm not expecting that either.
It's a ridiculous accusation. It takes a lot more courage to have stick to your principles. We have an intellectual president, something that very rarely happens in America.
But we don't seem to have a leader, though.
But we have a constitutional lawyer, and the reason he's defending Snowden, and the reason there's a lot of disagreement in this question is there is a universal code of justice question here, and I think that Obama probably feels that that Russia should cooperate over this. I do not agree with him. I've said on this radio station that I think they should defend Snowden. But I think, if you're talking about how to build a better citizenry, I think rule of law in Russia, rule of law in China, rule of law in America, this is essential to all of us.
You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. Alexander, can I go to you now? Where do we go from here? I mean, we had here, Andrey said we're in an episode. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of describing it right now. Are we just in an episode, or is there something structurally wrong with this relationship? Or does it really matter how well Washington and Moscow get along these days?
I think it does matter, because when Washington and Moscow talk properly and there's understanding, a lot of problems start to disappear, or at least there is a solution found to them. And when we have this rhetoric coming from America, a hostile rhetoric, it impacts on many other regions automatically. And that is how it works. But what we are missing here as well is that America starts its sort of attacks on Russia usually, and other countries as well, about human rights when it's got problems at home in the economy. And the problems are enormous. We have that banking sector in America that is strangling the economy. We have a privately run central bank called the U.S. Federal Reserve, where a bunch of bankers who have caused the previous crash are now deciding what to do next. They're printing billions of new dollars. They're creating a problem for the next several generations. And they are having the so-called growth, which is a joke. It's just printing and throwing money at the banks, again, by the way. And so Obama is quite at a loss what to do. And let me tell you something else. My sources in Washington are saying that the attitude to Obama is now, we wait till he goes and we talk to the next president, because this guy is not doing anything at all.
Charlie and I are sitting here smiling at each other because the Russian economy depends on the American economy. Obama saved the American economy, and we'd love to see, he saved the American economy, and you depend on this, and we would love to see much more entrepreneurial activity in Russia rather than just selling gas to people, which is what you're doing at the moment.
Well,
I think you ought to have courts that guarantee your contracts.
Has prevented Russia from becoming a symbol of international
Alexander, I'd like also to say that I was really looking forward to being here with a descendant of Tolstoy and Nekrassov. I'm a writer, and I came here for cultural reasons. And I think the reason the Russians and Americans ought to be talking to each other is because we have deep cultural affinities. We have reasons to be talking. We should not be talking in terms of Cold War or politics or policy in the Middle East. I mean, we've been lovers in war, and we're in lovers in peace. We are no longer a strategic balances relationship. We should not be in the antithetical, as Carl Jung would have said.
We're talking about American government and not the American nation. So let's not put them together.
Well, that's true of the Russian people and the Russian government.
The American government at the moment does not reflect the interests of its people. That's the problem.
But that's true of the Russian government.
Well, I wouldn't say that, because the American government is now creating a terrible mess in the economy, sucking up to the banks, which has a privately run central bank.
Whether we get Larry Summers or Yellen, and I'd like to debate that with Charlie. Are we going to get Larry Summers, or are we going to get Yellen? That's going to be definitive.
Actually, too close and too warm relations between the United States and Russia are abnormal. And it would not happen, actually. And the periods when we had this kind of relations in these decades.
So you don't like us, you mean?
At periods, yeah, there were periods when something wrong was happening either in Russia or in the United States, actually. Either it would be a period of Yeltsin rule or it would be a period just after the end of the Cold War. I think that we have some disagreements that are systemic, I would put it in scientific way. We would not make it easier for us if we would just soften the language or soften the policies. We have disagreements, and we do not have an institutional, economic base which helps to our countries, to our economies, and to our societies relate more closely.
These are love relations compared to the Cold War. How can you possibly say that the discussions between Russia and America are hostile compared to the way they were? I remember the way they were. I'm older than everybody at this table. I saw people coming out of Sikushki in Russia.
But I'll say this much, and I think this is a failure on the part of the Obama State Department and Mr. Obama, is you should be able to have disagreements, but still keep them in separate boxes. You know, we're letting the Snowden thing, and again, I think Snowden should be back to face the justice, and I'm not happy that Mr. Putin's given him asylum.
Well,
but that said,
wait, isn't that the crux of the whole thing here? Is that Obama felt like he had to make some kind of gesture because there's a lot of pressure in Congress.
I'm not sure about that, but
saying that Obama must do something, and the easiest, simplest thing was to do was to snub Putin because nobody likes Putin in Washington anyway.
Because I think that's a big mistake. There is some pressure, but again, a proper diplomacy, you keep things in different spheres and different boxes. You can sit there and disagree on Snowden and still meet and work on things that are vastly more important, such again as Syria, Iran, destabilization in the Middle East, and see where you can both lead together and work in common interests. And that doesn't seem to be happening, or if it is, and maybe it is to an extent, it's not happening to the extent it should.
Well, James, if I can go to you, that's a very good point. I'm glad that was brought up. But now the Geneva 2.0, the peace process, or at least proposed peace process for Syria is being pushed out to October now. And that's not because the Russian side is holding it back, because the Americans can't figure out who to talk to. Who's the other side?
Well, can you figure out who to talk to? Look at the states and look at the streets of Cairo right now. I was two nights ago with
another American mess.
With one of the,
in my opinion.
Well, actually, you could say it's a mess created between the Egyptian army and the Israeli army too. But I mean, what is the matter with democracy in the Arab world? I mean, I think that Yossi Mecklenburg was just on Sky saying that to go in and tell Morsi to leave the office right away makes a coup of it. I think that was a very strange and scary thing for them to have done down there. I mean, what we're hoping for in the whole region is that there will be an emergence. I'm not that I'm wildly enthusiastic about democracy in the Arab world, but I mean, it has to eventually come, and I think there's a whole generation of Arabs that want to move towards that. So America is actually staying out of all of that. That is why this confusion you keep attributing to him. He does not want to get involved. He wants to help out whoever seems to be pushing the thing forward.
You can also make the argument the United States was playing all sides at the same time in Egypt, and it's one of the reasons why it's turned into such a mess, and it's one of the reasons why the United States is such an unpopular country right now in Egypt.
It's an unpopular country because the Cairo speech was betrayed by the...
Moscow, last word here.
Well, actually, I think that in Russia, we don't see any affinity towards the democratic promotion in the Arab East. First of all, because we have a shared border with a lot of this region, and we know what type of political culture exists there. The modern Western-type democracy could not survive in that region, as it could not survive, for example, in the Russian Northern Caucasus or in the Central Asia, which borders Russia. What was called in Egypt a democratic transition after Mubarak has fallen is now coming to a military rule, a military coup, which quite an unexpected result, actually.
Well, as we're doing this program, all of the governors now in the state, in the country of Egypt are now military.
Well, they're reversing this trend, and they're trying to come back to the structure they had. Actually, there is some logic in this, but what is happening actually, it is a comeback to the period when Mubarak has structured his rule in Egypt around his military. And thus, where is democracy? I don't think that any kind of foreign interference in these affairs would provide with sufficient or effective or sustainable result.
All right, gentlemen, on that note here, I think I can mention the consensus opinion here. There is no crisis in U.S.-Russian relations. I want to thank Alexander, James, Charlie, and my guest here in the studio, Andrey, for being with us here on Debating Russia on Voice of Russia.